Hello and welcome to this installment of the Russia Question. I'm the director of the Russian program at Fordham University, and I'm the host of this webinar, Michael Ossorgin. The Russia Question is one of many initiatives of the Orthodox Christian Studies Center at Fordham University. The Fordham Center facilitates funds and publishes scholarship on the Orthodox Christian world, broadly understood. To learn more about the center and its initiatives or publications, please visit the website at www.fordham.edu/orthodoxy. We would also encourage you to follow us on YouTube and to share this and other videos with anyone who might benefit from it. So today we are joined by Clemena Antonova, who is a Bulgarian academic based in Vienna, Austria, where she is in charge of the Eurasia in Global Dialogue program at the Institute for Human Sciences. Her areas of specialization are the art of the icon and Russian religious philosophy, with a focus on Pavel Florensky. Some of her latest publications are her book, which we'll be discussing today, Visual Thought in Russian Religious Philosophy, and a guest-edited special issue, The Science of Art, Visuality at an Interdisciplinary Crossroads in the Leonardo Journal in 2021. Chapters in 2 Oxford Handbooks, which we've actually discussed on this program. The Oxford Handbook of Russian Religious Thought, and forthcoming Oxford Handbook of Apophatic Theology. She also curated the ongoing exhibition of contemporary icons called Icons for Our Time, Orthodox Art from Around the World at the Museum of Russian Icons in Clinton, Massachusetts. So Clemena, welcome to the Russia Question, and I'm delighted to finally meet you. We have so many interests in common, so this is an especially personally interesting interview for me.
Well, Michael, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me, and thanks for showing interest in my work. You know, I thought how you showed the book, it looks very nice from the front. Otherwise, it's a very, very short book, which actually tells me that if anyone is interested, they can really read it. So I don't want to just repeat what I say in the book. I just want to try to orient my talk today, and I hope it will be a discussion rather than just me speaking.
Yeah.
Well, really, the topic of your seminar, which is the Russia Question, and because on one level, the book is actually about showing that, in my view, Russian religious philosophy, and specifically the work of Pavel Florensky, is not interesting just as a matter of intellectual history, something very interesting and intellectually exciting that happened in this period, the Silver Age in Russia, or the fin du siècle. But it is actually a philosophical project which has actual relevance nowadays. And this has been actually one of the motivations for writing this book. And, you know, I'm now looking at what you have behind you, Svoboda Ukraini. And, you know, I'm thinking to what an extent these last several days, everyone, but I think especially those of us who grew up with Russian culture, studying the whole region, you know, Central and Eastern Europe and so on, who have been reading Russian novels, looking at Russian, Ukrainian art and so on. How I think that for all of us, this whole situation weighs especially heavily. Well, naturally, the victims are mainly the Ukrainian people, but I think that there is something about speaking the language and knowing and being excited about the culture, you know, that makes you feel, you know, I was thinking about it, how you know, I think it's almost like you feel implicated because you're so much part of this culture. So in this sense, I realized that on the one hand, my book is so different and so far away from this topic because, you know, I look at material from the beginning of the 20th century. The historical context, the social context was completely different. I fully realize that. But I also think that there's certain, to me, they look like very striking analogies between our situation and the situation of almost exactly 100 years ago. And I'm saying exactly because one of the texts that I've been looking at in my book is a famous essay that Florensky wrote exactly in 1922 called The Iconostasis. And in this sense, I'll be looking at this period. And I think that there are several things that actually strike me as being very similar. For example, you know, I think how nowadays we have this tendency of describing our contemporary experience in terms of crisis. You know, there are many other words you can use, catastrophe, tragedy, whatever. But we keep talking about crisis, the coronavirus crisis, before that, the financial crisis, the climate crisis, now there's the Ukrainian crisis and so on. And I think that for anyone who works on the early 20th century, this sounds strikingly similar. Because in this period, you hear everyone in the Western world, in Russia as well, talking about the crisis of modernity. And I think that this is, in a way, the central issue. And it is the central issue not only in Russia, but I think in Russia there is a very specific take on that. So in a way, this is the Russian question. And there is a longer history that goes back to the 19th century, but it plays out in very interesting ways, I think, in these years, the 1910s and the 1920s. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, the longer history is that the whole talk about the crisis of modernity actually goes back to the German Romantics in the 19th century. And it is exactly the same language that was taken by Russian religious philosophers in the 19th century from the very beginning and the birth of Russian religious philosophy. So the whole idea of the Romantics was that they were reacting against the philosophy of the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason. Now, everybody knows that. And this is very much the main idea that goes from there into Russian religious philosophy, but then the Russian answer to the problem of modernity is very specifically Russian. And I think that it is interesting to see how this sort of language keeps coming up throughout the whole history of Russian religious philosophy. For example, one of the major figures, of course, is Vladimir Solovyov. His first major book, which was published in, I think it's 1874, was called The Crisis of Western Philosophy, on positivism or something like that. Then you see the whole generation around Florensky at the beginning of the 20th century also engaging with this issue, the issue of crisis. Probably no one did this more than Berdyaev. Now, Nikolai Berdyaev is probably the best known of this whole generation of religious philosophers in the West. So at some point he published, I think this was 1910, he published a book called The Crisis of the Intelligentsia. 1918, he published a book, The Crisis of Art. So this talk about crisis was there. And I'd like to read to you something which somehow sounded very revealing to me about the period and also about Florensky and this whole milieu that he came from. Now, this is by Alexei Losev, and he talks about the period immediately after the Russian Revolution. And, you know, Losseff and Florensky are probably the only two major figures in philosophy who weren't killed or who didn't immigrate. Most of the friends and colleagues of Florensky immigrated in 1922, the years before that. Then a lot of the others were killed, disappeared. Florensky himself was executed, murdered, basically, in 1937. So in these years after the revolution, this is what Alexei Losseff says of Florensky. So he says, at the beginning of the revolution, Florensky used to deliver public papers and lectures whose principal idea was of imminent and inevitable catastrophe. In a muffled and hardly audible voice, his eyes eternally cast down, this engineer predicted that nothing would remain in place, that everything would lose its structure and form, and everything would disintegrate, be destroyed, and atomized completely. I myself attended these terrifying lectures. So you see, what I'm trying to make a point about here is that the language we use and the language at the beginning of the 20th century was very similar. And in a way, one of the things I've been interested in was, and I've been thinking about, was how this whole question of crisis was taken up in one way by the Bolsheviks. You know, Lenin was sending telegrams to the Central Committee of the party in the autumn of 1917. The crisis is ripe. For him, this was an opportunity, a good thing, you have to take power. And at the same time, you see Russian religious philosophers who reacted in a completely different way, not just to the revolution, not just to the aftermath of the First World War, but to this whole period, which they saw as being exemplified by the crisis of Western philosophy. So for Florensky, it was in a way, you know, the end of the world, you know, what for Lenin was a great opportunity. So I think that this is the sort of background of, in a way, what becomes for me a Christian philosophy of crisis. So I think that it would make sense to see a lot of these people around Florensky and Florensky himself as belonging to a generation that used, that sort of developed a Christian philosophy of crisis, which the main function of this philosophy wasn't just about going back and bringing, you know, material from medieval theology and so on. So I don't think that the right way to look at this tradition is like backward-looking, mystical, and so on, the way it's usually described. I think it's actually an extremely modern way of tackling problems of modernity and actual problems in the world around you by looking back and drawing material from medieval theology, but completely modernizing. This is why, for me, basically, I keep thinking about Florensky in two ways. I think he's sometimes described as an art historian. I think if he's an art historian, he's quite a bad art historian, and you will see
why. I agree.
So he's often described as a theologian, but then theologians feel very uncomfortable about him for various reasons, you know. But I think that this is not quite the right way to approach him, in the sense that you miss a lot about this kind of philosophy. I think he's a religious philosopher who was engaged with what I'll call a religious project of modernity. And actually, I'm borrowing the term from a book by Rowan Williams on Dostoevsky. I think it's an excellent book. And basically, he talks about Dostoevsky as being engaged in a project of religious modernity. And I think that this whole generation, first 2 decades of the 20th century, of religious thinkers were doing exactly that. And I think what they're doing is something very, very modern, you know, and I think it is something very relevant nowadays.
I completely agree, and I think that it's especially urgent. If I could take the opportunity to point us into the direction of an amazing resource on this, which was an emergency session that the Orthodox Christian Studies Center held on Ukraine, Ukraine religion and Russia, and in it are expressed so many nuanced and knowledgeable views about the role of religion in Putin's ideology, which is the terrifying side of it, and the complexity of it as well. That there are dissidents within the church who are resisting Putin, right? And then there are hierarchs all the way up to the top in Kirill, who are basically performing at his will in so many ways, right? I'll just say very quickly as an introduction to this video, because we absolutely must speak about the Ukraine invasion, right? So the panel, very quickly, it focuses on Putin's invasion of Ukraine, his fascist manipulation of the church, the complex role of Orthodox Christianity. Brandon Gallagher, and it does an excellent job of articulating the ideology of Holy Rus or Ruski Mir, the Russian world, right, as a kind of ethno-national religious fundamentalism. He points out that Putin's violent and delusional Nazism essentially could not be more anti-Orthodox Christian in spirit or practice. Regina Elsner reminds us that the white Christian, and quotation, fascist movement belongs to a more troubling international current of reactionary political theology. And Kirill Hovarun's opening statement is directed towards Putin as a Manichaean heretic. That is, he's engaged in theology, but he does a terrible job of it. And so these are just to introduce you to some of the ideas. He also sees himself, believe it or not, as, and this is exactly relevant to the point that you brought up about repeating history. The West is who he's warring against, but he's demonized the West completely. And he sees himself as the defender of something true in Orthodoxy, right? That in Holy Rus that belongs to Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine as he sees it. So one of the ideas put forward is that we have to resist in circles like ours and in grassroots scenarios, from the ground up, that is, this kind of kowtowing to a fascist ideology. And Florensky was dealing with fascism of a different sort, perhaps, but certainly trying to be a voice as it took over, right? So I think that it's especially important to look to these thinkers for their engagement with modernity, rather than the sort of reactionist stance that everything that's modern and Western is evil and corrupting religious practices.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. I think that there are two issues here, which I think are very relevant to the whole religious philosophical movement I'm talking about. So on the one hand, this sort of opposition between Russia and the West, which has a long history in Russian culture, for anyone who starts working seriously on philosophy and literature and all that, of course, you realize how very artificial this opposition is. Because the whole Russian project I'm talking about here, so not just Florensky, but the whole movement of ideas that he belongs to. So going back to the Slavophiles in the middle of the 19th century, and then Solovyov and so on. On the one hand, this philosophy is meant to be an alternative to Western philosophy, and Western philosophy seen in a state of crisis and as the deep reason for the crisis of modernity and of Western civilization. On the other hand, you see all the time that this alternative philosophy is actually reacting against one strand of Western philosophy. It may be the mainstream of Western philosophy, but it is only one strand within it. There's a great focus on the Enlightenment and especially Kant. At the same time, it is a philosophy which builds on and borrows ideas. And its whole terminology it relies very heavily on another strand within Western philosophy. The German Romantics, Nietzsche. There's been quite a lot of interesting research on the influence of Nietzsche on Russian religious thinkers and so on. So in other words, like with any simplification, when you talk about the West is varied, you know. When you talk about Europe is so varied, you know. Sweden is not at all the same like Bulgaria, where I come from. And when people like Florensky were attacking the West, you know, Western philosophy itself, there were various currents within the Western philosophy that were very critical of the Enlightenment project. So in this sense, you know, I always wonder what are the right words to use in order to describe the whole project. Because I think on the one hand, this project is very strongly and explicitly anti-Western, but it is anti-Western in the sense of counter-Enlightenment with a focus on Kant. On the other hand, it can be allied, and it is allied very closely with other currents of Western philosophy that are themselves very critical of the Enlightenment. And this makes it interesting because it's not just about a 19th century, early 20th century history. I think it is interesting to see that there are various ideas that you actually recognize from postmodern philosophy. Heidegger, for example, you know, there have been studies on Heidegger and Florensky. Now, Heidegger knew nothing of Florensky, and certainly Florensky didn't know of Heidegger, but they use very often the same language. For example, in the writings of on art by Heidegger from the 60s, there's no influence, there's no question of influence, but the language is similar because they react against the same type of idea that they found poisonous, you know. So in this sense, the whole thing, a bit like nowadays, you know, you take a stand against the West. Well, there are a lot of things that are wrong with the West, but there's nothing like the West. Within the West, you have so many movements and ideas, and people are fighting over various issues, you know. And I think that this also has to do with the whole project being very much a project against the Western notion of modernity. But then again, modernity is such a complex, multi-layered notion. Modernity comes with democracy and human rights and a lot of liberal ideas.
Dignity,
so
yes.
Yeah, ideas of human dignity and so on. And at the same time, modernity has allowed racism. Modernity has gone along very well with
enabled it,
imperialism and anti-Semitism and so on. So the very idea of modernity is complex. The very idea of the West is complex. And when nowadays people, you know, say we are, you know, against the West is humiliating Russia and all that. Again, I mean, which part of the West, who, what do you mean?
Yes, absolutely.
And now, it is also true that with Florensky, there is this tendency of simplification and actually having this very passionate, explosive rhetoric against the West. But I think you always have to understand it as what he means is this specific movement within Western philosophy. So this is one thing. And the other thing which you said, which I think is very interesting, is that Florensky is probably one of the really interesting examples within his generation of the complicated relationship between Russian religious philosophy and the church. And I think he's so interesting because, unlike many of the other figures, he was himself a priest. And unlike many of the other figures, he was never excommunicated or kicked out of the church. At the same time, he held a number of ideas that the official church had actually proclaimed heretical. Like, for example, he was one of the most vocal...
Like all of the most interesting philosophers.
Yes, so I think, I think that one of the things I keep noticing when I work with this material from the beginning of the 20th century is that you have such exciting intellectual ideas, but they don't seem to happen within the channels of the Russian church. They happen very much outside the channels of the Russian church, very much by their proponents, actually philosophers. Very often they are philosophers and thinkers that have been openly at odds with the church. Like, think about Tolstoy being excommunicated. Nobody did more to bring back Orthodox Christianity center stage than Tolstoy. And it's so ironical that he was excommunicated in 1905. So, and then you have people like Florensky, who always very strongly identified with the church, at the same time was holding openly views which were obviously antagonistic to the position of the church. So I think that this whole situation is very interesting, and I think that it needs to be studied a little bit more.
Yes.
And this is something I haven't worked on myself that much, but it is interesting to see that in the years before the revolution, there were very interesting things happening within the hierarchy of the church. For example, there was this very important council in 1918. It was interrupted by the revolution. But, a lot of the participants in the council of the church were actually lay people. So the whole idea was to modernize the church. At the same time, you wouldn't have had a council like that within the Catholic Church, for example. So it was there were very interesting things going on. But, history at the time just didn't allow these developments to go their normal way.
So wonderful. And let's take a concrete example of what you're describing, where Florensky specifically reacts against the West, right? And you write about this. And he writes about it in reverse perspective, where he takes on Kant, among other thinkers, right? Particularly this for Florensky, and there are really good arguments for really smart people who argue that he just doesn't get Kant, and I think that he definitely makes a straw man out of Kant. But for Florensky, needless to say, he uses Kant as a model of the anthropocentric worldview, right? And the realism that is associated with the anthropocentric view in Florensky is attached with Kant for him, right? Because just as in Kant, we have these categories that allow us to filter the world from our perspective, and that is reality. That is how we recreate reality to our minds through those categories, let's say. And then you have the analog in realist painting, where everything that is far away is tiny for me, right, at the center of that artistic world, and everything that is big is closer to me. So it's, for him, he kind of conflates the two, that they're both egocentric worldviews, and he's looking in reverse perspective in that theory for a way to break out of that, right? That is to sort of to not be subject to the categories, to not have to equate reality with how it appears to the eye, right? And this relates to his theory of the novel. Could you say a bit about that?
I'd be very happy to say about that, but can I say something? There's a question, I think, in the chat, and I wouldn't like to miss that.
Oh, this.
Oh
Yeah,
no,
this is.
isn't
I
yours?
put that up. We've not yet
Yes,
switched to.
yeah,
Yeah, you could put a chat question in the chat at any
yes.
moment, by the way, and we'll field it.
You know, I think that this sort of goes to the heart of what my book is about, because my book is not about Russian religious philosophy as such, or the philosophy of Florensky. I only focus on writings by Florensky that deal specifically with the icon and with questions of visuality. And this is why I use this term, visual thought, in Russian religious philosophy. And under visual thought, I understand the conceptualization of philosophical ideas or theological ideas. It could be even secular ideas, in the case of Florensky's religious philosophical ideas, through visual categories. Now, some of these visual categories are actually categories is actually terminology that we know from art history. And this gives the sense that somehow he's writing art history. Probably the basic art historical term that people in the field deal with is perspective, you know. So when you use the term reverse perspective, you sort of give the impression that you're going to talk about visual analysis of works of art, how space is constructed in a painting. This is what it seems to refer to. But actually, I think that this whole theory that he develops of reverse perspective is an aspect of philosophy. And as an
I could not agree more. Yes,
it is a very I think, exciting and a very good way of actually conceptualizing his ideas. If you think about it as art history, I will show you some pictures and I think that it will be a bit clearer. It's very, very bad art history. If you use these terms in order to actually analyze principles of the construction of pictorial space in icons, you're not going to get very far. Right. There's some very good insights and so on, because he was such a brilliant man. But I don't think that he was interested in the history of art. I think he was interested in refuting Kantian philosophy, the way you described that. And to do so, he used a very original way of going about it, which is actually to use visuality in order to give a concrete expression to these philosophical ideas. And you see, I think it's a very clever way of doing it, because one of the main criticisms of Russian thinkers of Western philosophy was that Western philosophy was very abstract. So they said they would come up with a concrete philosophy. Actually, the term concreteness, so concreteness, is a very central term to this whole project. And Florensky talks about concrete metaphysics. And now think about it. What is more concrete than something which is visual? So I think that the whole thinking about icon, image, perspective, symbol in terms of a visual symbol, and so on, all this terminology has to do with this philosophical way of conceptualizing ideas through visuality. And just something very concretely in response to what you just said. You know, in Kantian philosophy, there is an opposition between phenomenon and noumenon. So we live in the world of senses, so we see phenomena, and we can describe them because these are things we can see, touch, explain, and so on. And then there is the higher world, let's call it the world of God. And we can't say anything about it. And also, and this is what I think was the main butt of Florensky's criticism, that the two worlds have nothing in common. They're completely separate. Now, if the two worlds have nothing in common, it means that as a religious believer, you have no possibility of approaching God. You have no connection to him. He doesn't hear you. You talk, but he doesn't listen. So you stand in front of an icon and you pray. Well, from this point of view, you're talking to yourself, because there's no one there. There is an object, there is a picture, and you're talking to a picture like a crazy person. Now, for someone like Florensky, this was unbearable, because the icon, the whole experience of the icon is that it provides the meeting point between God and man. You're not a subject standing in front of an object. The whole of Western philosophy, that the mainstream of that Western philosophy, sees the relationship between subject and object, the knowing subject and the passive object. But this is not what happens in the experience of the icon. When you are standing before an icon, literally, as an art historian I know wrote a book where the title is "The Object Stares Back." Literally, the object stares back because you believe that in some way Christ is really present in his icon. The Mother of God is really present in her image. In this sense, if you believe that, you're not talking to a panel, to an object, and you're certainly not talking to yourself. You're talking to Christ who listens to you. So it is extremely important. It is the most important thing from the point of view of a Christian believer, that this whole thing takes place. And what happens is very different from subject and object, because the two are in a much more interactive relationship. It's no longer subject versus object, because you're communicating with someone who in some way is present there and listens to you. And I think because Michael, is that question? Okay. Well, no. I think that what was I going to say? That yes, I think I wanted to react to something you said, but it skipped my mind.
That's fine. Well, yeah. Well, yes, so, I wanted to maybe pick up on your point, because you talk about the project of deesis, right? That is the deification of the world, and I know that this is something that so many of the Russian religious philosophers were interested in, because like you describe, if the transcendent world is truly transcendent and we have nothing to do with it, then there's no way of communicating with it, and there's no way of sort of receiving it into the world, then it's meaningless, right? And they're looking for, these Russian religious philosophers, particularly Bulgakov, Berdyaev, Florensky, Solovyov, are looking for ways to usher the transcendent into reality, into the sensory world, right? To deify it through themselves first, through the making of themselves as icons, almost first, right? Or to making of ourselves as icons first, who can reflect that kind of presence that you're talking about, that's in the icon. So you are making me think of deesis as you spoke about, that kind of link between the transcendent and the sensory.
Yes, thank you. And this actually reminded me of what I wanted to respond to your comment before, because these two are actually connected. So I think that it is interesting, because Florensky always makes such a big deal that the heart of his worldview, and he writes this in personal letters to his children, to his friends. These are the last letters he wrote from the Gulag. He talks about his worldview, which is based on the symbol, and that he believes that what is symbolized in the symbol, what is named in the name, what is represented in the icon is really present. So the idea of presence is something very important, and it is important because if you take this away, what remains is, you know, from the point of view of a religious believer, nothing. So, and I think that this is something I think is actually quite interesting. You know, when he says what is named in the name, he was actually reacting to a very interesting intellectual development at the beginning of the 20th century. 1913, there was a big revival of hesychasm among the Russian monks. Among the Russian monks on Mount Athos. And there was a big scandal about it because the Russian church proclaimed this practice, I will explain what it comes to be heretical. And then a lot of people, Florensky, Lossev, a lot of the big names at the time got involved in the debate that came out of this incident. And they came out very strongly in support of the monks. Now, this hesychast practice came down to the belief that during the Jesus prayer, when you pronounce the name of God, God is present in his name. So by speaking out the name, you in some way evoke the presence of God. Now, these ideas that Florensky was writing about in the 1910s, especially after 1913 and the incident on Mount Athos, focus very much on the idea of the symbol, where the name is a symbol in the sense that it really contains the presence of God. And he takes this idea of presence, which he looked at in the context of language in the 1910s. And in the 1920s, he uses this idea to describe the experience of the icon. So you see the way God is present in his name during the prayer. In the same way, God is present in his image within the icon. So you stand before an icon of Christ and he's there. So I think that it is actually interesting to see how this concern with language sort of spills over into concern with visuality. So this is one thing. It has to do, it was really provoked, as is very usual with Florensky, that it was provoked by a concrete contemporary incident. You know, the debate around, they were called Imya Slavia, which means name worshippers, you know. So
Scott Kenworthy writes a great article in the Oxford Handbook about that.
Yes. So something else that I thought was quite interesting, again, that it is interesting that usually people think, and the general idea is that all these Russian religious thinkers like Florensky, Bulgakov, Paul Evdokimov, and so on, who wrote on the icon, that they went back to Byzantine theology of the image and sort of revived it within the context of their writings in the 20th century. Now, I think that actually Florensky does something quite different, and it is interesting to see what he does exactly. He uses language that builds on Byzantine theology of the image. Now, Byzantine theology of the image was developed in its final form in the context of the Byzantine iconoclastic controversy in the 8th and the 9th centuries. The big figures there are John of Damascus, Theodore the Studite, and so on. So Florensky uses some of the language that comes from this intellectual tradition. For example, the icon being a window to God's world and so on. But I think that what he really builds on is a later Byzantine tradition, which is the teaching of Saint Gregory Palamas in the 14th century. and this is something that you reminded me of, actually, Michael, when you sent me some of your comments, you know, that actually Palamas is the revival of Palamite teaching is a very important factor within the development of Russian religious philosophy at the beginning of the 20th century. Now, this is interesting because nobody from this generation had actually read Palamas in the original. He wasn't available in the original. But nevertheless, the teaching of Palamas about divine energies and divine essence became very important to this whole generation of philosophers. So in other words, Florensky's theory of the icon from the 1920s built on his theory of language from the 1910s. And it is based on applying Palamite teaching, the teaching of divine essence and energies, to the name and to the icon. And just to open a bracket here, because probably not everybody is familiar with that. I wasn't very familiar with it before I started working on it. But basically, Saint Gregory Palamas is a 14th century Byzantine theologian. Now, at the time, he developed his teaching in reaction to another, revival of Hesychast practice. So something very similar to what was happening on Mount Athos at the beginning of the 20th century. And he developed the theology in order to explain what exactly Hesychasts, most of them were monks, meant when they said, when you speak out the name of God, God himself is present in his name. Now, if God himself is fully present in his name, if God himself is fully present in his icon, it means you believe in magic. So you have to explain in what way he's partially present, but not fully. In what sense?
Right. Yes.
So
Good.
Gregory Palamas comes with this terminology, which he borrows from Aristotle. In Aristotle, everything, every being, everything that exists has essence and energies. In a way, think about the essences like nowadays we would say identity. My identity is the same throughout my life. But my essence, the outer aspects about me, change over time. I'm younger, then I get unfortunately older, I get
your energy,
yes,
Mm-hmm.
whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this aspect of you that changes and this aspect that sustains among changes. And Palamas takes that and uses it in order to describe the relationship between God and man. So he says that there's no way you can know, describe, or represent the divine, because the divine is utterly and completely different from our world of the senses. It is utterly and completely different in terms of its divine essence. There's no way you can know about that. But the divine communicates with us through its energies. And you see, it is a very original idea, I think, what Florensky did, because Palamas himself never speaks about the icon. He doesn't apply this teaching to the icon. He talks about the relationship between God and man. Florensky takes that and he says, this is exactly what happens in the experience provided by the icon. You stand before an icon of Christ. The essence, the divine essence is not there. You cannot possibly know the divine essence. But God communicates through his divine energies. And in this sense, he is, at least in part, present. So I think it's a very interesting way, in a very original way. Nobody had done it before Florensky, to use this sort of analogy. So can I ask?
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's as clear of an explanation as we're going to get about Florensky's wonderful work there. Yeah, can you ask what, please?
I wanted to ask if anyone has any questions about this more sort of theoretical part, because I'd like to show you some pictures to just illustrate you how this,
Please.
just to illustrate to you how this works in terms of icons.
You
By
can
the
show
way,
us, and I'll keep an eye out for the questions.
yeah, can I ask from the people who are listening to us, has anyone heard about Florensky? Did you know about Florensky before, or you want me to just say a few sentences about him?
They've taken my class, so they've at least heard about it. I have a lot to say about him.
Just in a few words, you know, he's very often referred to nowadays as the Russian Leonardo, because he had an expertise in so many different fields. He has a background which is in a way typical of many people of his generation. He studied mathematics and physics, then he became involved in the very famous Moscow School of Mathematics. So a lot of his writing has to do with this sort of background. Then he studied theology. He wrote one of the most important and influential theological treatises at the time. And when the Bolsheviks came to power, and when everybody else around him, people who were priests, and theologians, and religious philosophers, were basically kicked out of the country, he stayed. And the reason he stayed is because the Bolsheviks saw him as a scientist, which is what he was, you know. And so he started working on applied science. There's something like 17, 19, I don't know how many scientific patents in his name. So he was working for the Bolsheviks in applied science. And it is in this period, the first years after the revolution, that he started writing on questions relating to visuality. And I think probably one of the reasons for that was that at the time, it was almost impossible to write theology or religious philosophy or anything like that. So in a way, he was expressing all these ideas that were important for him in the field of philosophy through, it's almost a bit like a cover, like he was writing about a neutral topic like art history. So, and then in 1933, he was arrested once, exiled, and he came back. And then he was sent to a gulag. He was actually moved from one camp to another. Eventually, he ended up at the first gulag in Russia, Solovki on the White Sea, and he was murdered there in 1937. So this is the year of the purges in 1937. And again, because he has this very interesting, what we would call nowadays, interdisciplinary background, it's not very clear, at least to me, why he was murdered, because he fell in the category of several types of people who are being killed. Religious thinkers, but there was a big purge against so-called bourgeois specialists. You know, people from the Moscow School of Mathematics were very severely persecuted as well. So it's not very clear to me in which of these categories he fell. But you know, terror works the best in this way, when you keep everyone under suspicion, and you can end up, you know, sent to a camp without even knowing why. So yeah.
Well, I would suggest that that's a great introduction to him for those who don't know about him, and we should probably take a quick look at the images, because we have 5 minutes remaining. So,
this very quick. In this case, let me see. I'll just put this down just for 1 second. Okay, now I'm going back here. Okay, I'll share the screen. I'm not very good with these things, but okay. Now let me see. Can you see my screen? Sorry, can you see the screen?
Yes, we can see the screen. Yeah.
Okay. So I just wanted to show you my protagonist, you know. So basically, this is a painting in the Tretyakov Gallery. And you see here Pavel Florensky in the foreground, dressed in a cassock. He was a priest, and he's walking together with Sergei Bulgakov. Sergei Bulgakov was very, very strongly influenced by Florensky, and he's one of these people who immigrated to Paris. So in a way, it is interesting to think of how ideas within Russian religious philosophy, but also specifically the thinking of Florensky through the Russian diaspora, especially in Paris, trickled into Western theology, Catholic thinking, in some ways, something which hasn't been done but is very interesting, to look at the Russian contribution to the discussions of Vatican II. That's something quite important. And Florensky, I think, is an important figure there. His ideas, this is in a way the way that they got to the West, through people like Bulgakov. And now, I'd like to move to something which has nothing to do with icon, but is important, because in 1913, Florensky and Bulgakov went together to see the collection of paintings by Picasso. There was a collection in the house of a very wealthy Russian merchant in Moscow called Sergei Shchukin. Sergei Shchukin knew Matisse. He was very much involved with artists in the West, and he had a collection of early paintings by Picasso. And this is not a painting in this collection. It's actually in the Metropolitan in New York. It's probably one of the most important paintings of the 20th century. So this is, does anyone know which painting is that? I'm waiting for the students. It's actually Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon.
Mm-hmm.
So 1907. The paintings in Shchukin's collection date from this period. So this is the early Picasso. Now, what is interesting here about this painting is, I don't know if anyone can try to explain why the figures, or at least some of the figures, look so distorted. What is the principle that makes faces and figures look distorted? I think that the main thing here, and this is something which is very typical of Cubism, and especially early so-called analytical Cubism, is that you put together profile and frontal views. So you look at an object from several points of view, and you present them together. It's a little bit like, look at my cup. If you represent it from one point of view, it would look like that. But if you paint it in a Picasso painting, you would paint this, but then you would paint that, you can paint that. So you put different aspects of the object together on the same picture plane. So when Florensky went to this collection, this is exactly what caught his attention. And he wrote an article, it was a chapter in a book at the time, it was published in 1914, where he discusses Cubism exactly in terms of the way in which space is constructed. Now, why was this interesting for him? It was interesting to him because it looked very similar to the way that space is constructed in icon. And this is how Florensky came up with this term, additional or supplementary planes. Because you see, just in the way in which in Cubism an object is represented from different points of view, in an icon an object is represented from different points of view. You look here, this is a Russian the Russian icon from the 19th century of the death of Saint Nicholas. Look at the coffin. Basically, one side of the coffin is represented, and then you have this other side of the coffin which you cannot possibly see from the same point of view. You have to move around the object in order to see all these aspects. Then the coffin itself and the saint lying on the coffin is shown a bit like from the above rather than from the side. So what is happening here is that you have different points of view that have been synthesized within the same image. The logic is very similar to Cubism. Now, see also another icon that I would like to show you. Oh, I don't know what it's doing here. Oh, sorry. Now, okay, that's a bit unfortunate, but you get the main idea. This is a contemporary icon, which I included in this exhibition that Michael mentioned at the Museum of Russian Icons in Clinton. It's an icon by a contemporary Serbian artist, and it shows, as you can see, the Last Supper. It's a very canonical, standard arrangement of the Last Supper, even though to us it looks strange because we're so used to Leonardo's Last Supper, but in icons, it's very often represented like that. The reason I'm showing you this icon is that, again, the only way in which you can make sense of the space in the icon is to have these different points of view. So you see the table slightly from above, but then you see objects on the table, like the chalice in front of Christ is shown from the side, part of it from above. So you see that you don't have just one point of view. You have many points of view, certainly more than one, that have been put together. And this is what made it interesting for Florensky, because it meant that it is a completely different way of organizing space from what happens in Renaissance paintings. And the Renaissance is important because Florensky thought of the Renaissance as the basis of the modern worldview, the way we think of space and time. Exactly what Michael described, that when you look at a Renaissance painting, all the parallel lines, if they extend, so the beams, the windows, and so on, if you extend the parallel lines, they meet in a point in the distance. This is how you create a sense of depth. And this point is called the vanishing point. So in other words, objects that are further away from you are smaller. Objects that are closer to you are bigger. The whole painting is constructed according to the person who's looking at it. While in icons and in cubist paintings, you have a moving point of view within the picture space. So this was what attracted the attention of Florensky. And I think I should be stopping soon, but I just want to show you some very, very quickly. Now, do you know which is the icon over here? I'm asking any of the students. I'm sure you've seen this icon before. It's probably the most famous Russian icon by Andrei Rublev. It's called the Old Testament Trinity. Next to it, you have a painting by Malevich. And you see that the composition is very similar. You have three figures sitting around the table. And in Malevich's painting, you also have, and you even have a candle there. And let me show you another comparison. The first one is a Russian icon of Saint Elijah. And the second one is a painting by Chagall of the Burning House. And you see that you have a similar figure of a horse moving up to the sky and a little figure, and the figure is in red. So again, the composition is very similar. The reason I'm showing that is to give you a sense that already the Russian avant-garde, in the same period that Florensky was writing, so we're talking about the 1910s and the 1920s, were intentionally making an analogy between the way they were painting avant-garde paintings and Russian icons. So if you want, yeah. I'll stop here. I think I have some questions. I'm very happy to have some questions. Can I?
Yes, I do. I think maybe we'll take one. Just in the interest of time, we try to keep it under an hour. We've gone over 5, but it's been too interesting to stop. So
stop about that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's great. So let's see what we have here. Alexander Zhabenko asks, do you think it is a misleading approach to generalize a vast spectrum of philosophies for criticism, as it can be seen in the case of Florensky? Is his generalization of the Western philosophy caused by his desire to criticize, or by his criticism, or did his criticism appear from the generalization?
Well, I think this is, yeah, it's a bit of a difficult question in the sense that I think that, you know, it requires quite a long discussion. But I think, in short, that first of all, it's not so much about generalization. I think if it's a question of whether he does it intentionally or not, because obviously he's generalizing the West, you know, Kant, and so on. He's generalizing. But I don't think he's generalizing because he misunderstood and he thought somehow that Western philosophy was all the same, or you know, he intentionally misunderstands Kant over and over again. But I think he does this intentionally, and the reason I think he does it is because he thinks that within all the differences and varieties and all that, there's something at the heart of the Western philosophical project that is deeply wrong, and this is what he wanted to capture. So it's not about having a debate about subtleties and things like that, but it's about getting to the heart of the matter, which means that every time you go to the heart of the matter and you take everything else away, you know, you have to simplify and generalize. So in a way, I don't even think that there's a certain sense in which what he was doing is not like an intellectual enterprise, but it is really like being on a mission, because he thought this was so very important, you know. So it's very different from the way that I think most of us think about academic intellectual work. You know, it's being on a mission. And I think that actually it is very typical of Russian thinkers in this period, that they give you this sense that they're not just interested in having a discussion, you know, intellectually uncovering different things and so on, but they are on a mission because they think that there's something really, the world is in a state of crisis and we have to do something about it, you know.
Right. Yes, it's urgent. Yes. Well, that's a wonderful note to finish on. I hate to stop our conversation. I'm enjoying it too much. But I hope that you'll come back when I teach my Russian icon class in dialogue with the arts. And that way we can have much more to talk about.
I'd like to very much. And can I just say something before I go? I'd just like to say that if anyone has any sort of ideas or comments that came to your mind, sometimes people actually write to me a bit later, and that, you know, the various things which actually make you think about, you know, the material you're working with. So if you have any comments, you know, there might be criticisms, ideas, associations that come to your mind, please write to me.
That's a gift for everyone watching. I suggest you take her up on that offer. I have one student who just wrote on Florensky who might reach out to you soon. Thank you again so much, Clemena Antonova. Like I said, I read this book inside and out. I have notes, and you know, I even attempted Pascal's mystical hexagon at one point when I went down the rabbit hole. It was so stimulating, and you do a fantastic job of making sense of Florensky and bringing out the best in his seeming art history that is actually, I completely agree, his theology, his philosophy, right? So thank you so much for putting this book together. Again, it's called Visual Thought in Russian Religious Philosophy, Pavel Florensky's Theory of the Icon. I just want to say a very quick word, if I may, about our next event, and this is the law and the Christian tradition in modern Russia. We'll be speaking to the editors Paul Valgier and Randall Poole, and that'll be on April 1st, and that is not a joke. It's actually on April 1st. Please keep your eyes open for that. I want to thank our attendees and the co-directors of the Orthodox Christian Studies Center for providing the platform, George Demokopoulos and Aristotle Papanikolaou. the Associate Director, Nathaniel Wood, who is also the Managing Editor of the Studies Center publication of scholarly research called Public Orthodoxy. Look it up. There was a lot of great articles recently written about the Ukraine crisis, the Ukraine invasion, the Ukrainian atrocity. What can we call it? What else can we call it? Special thanks to Fordham's executive assistant Siobhan Varlesa and Catherine Mandelakis for helping to organize and promote the event. I hope that you'll come back on April 1st to join the discussion. And it's been an absolute pleasure to learn from you. Thank you so much, Clemena.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much. Say hello to Randall. By the way, he's a great speaker, so I'm sure you'll have all a great time.
He is. Yeah, we'll learn a lot from him too, that's for sure. And Paul, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye-bye. Thanks to all of you for listening to me. I hope I didn't bore you.
Impossible.
Bye-bye.